Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's quite a global group today, which is exciting. Today, we're going to cover three things as part of this. And as mentioned earlier, we welcome questions through the chat, and we hope to make this a productive dialogue throughout, both during the presentation as well as we'll save some time at the end. We're going to cover three things. The first is kind of business building in the crisis, kind of the case for doing this, if you will. Two is we see in our LEAP practice 6 archetypes emerging for business building. We're going to describe what those 6 are in a little bit of detail. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to do some Q&A at the end. Hopefully, we'll get to some of your questions and thoughts. If we flip to the next page. Pre-COVID, our research was showing that business building had gone from being a luxury off to the side to an imperative for most large companies and medium-sized companies as well. If you do any analysis of the S&P 500, the Fortune 500, you go down the list of the different kind of lists of large companies, if you will, the topmost companies, the key to remaining at that top for a long period of time tends to be serial building, serial regeneration, serial entrepreneurship. Whether it's a startup from 15 years ago that grew to be a social media giant today, or it's a traditional company that's been around for decades or even centuries that is always looking to build and rebuild. Business building, we're finding, is a requirement for long-term success. The crisis has further emphasized that point. Because the world has changed and is continuing to change, customer needs and expectations are changing, the pace of everything is accelerating. It's forcing companies to think differently and to act more quickly and to be much more entrepreneurial in what they do. So if we flip to the next page, a few things to ask just months ago. One is, how do you create natural, effective, human-like interactions with customers that you'll never meet? And that's the case in basically every industry today. Now we're in the midst, but there's also a view that it's going to be increasingly the case going forward, even once we get, quote unquote, past the crisis, whenever that will be. Two is, how do you repair devices you can't touch or hold? How do you use IoT, robotics, other technology to do that? Three is, from a recruiting perspective and a talent management perspective, how do you identify your next star employee from around the world? Again, without the traditional kind of recruiting tools and techniques, a lot of which are in person. And then the fourth one is this topic of resilience has become much more important. So how do you create a resilient business model with a resilient supply chain to enable your company to deal with not just this crisis, but disruptions as they come along going forward? If we flip to the next page, there are a few kind of assumptions that are being challenged now. Speed is one, right? Everybody, I think, felt, if you asked people 3 months ago, we are in a world with a lot of digital transformation, we're sprinting, we're changing, and frankly, we're doing a lot, and maybe it's a little too fast. Well, this crisis has forced us to think even faster. Privacy over comfort, right? Data privacy, a lot of emphasis on that. You look at outcomes today, there are examples of new apps being downloaded at rates never before seen. In Korea, there's the example of the 100-meter app, which tells people who download it whether there's a COVID case anywhere within 100 meters of where they are. There was 1 million downloads of this app within 10 days. And of course, to use the app, you need to give up private information like where you are. But people are doing it because it's giving them value in this new world. House buying is, one of many, many journeys we go on as individuals that you would never imagine you could do remotely. And now it's up dramatically in terms of houses that are being looked at through virtual tours, being assessed, and then eventually being sold remotely. These are just a few examples, but the point is there are changes of behavior that are happening that none of us, many of us, wouldn't have ever imagined, and we're being forced into it, and now we've rapidly made the change. And so if we are changing, what does that mean for products we consume? What does that mean for companies that make and deliver those products? It's no secret, and we'll show a chart in a second, but a lot of the giants today, giant companies, were born coming out of crises in the past. And so now we're in the middle of a crisis. What does this mean going forward? So with that, we're going to conduct just a quick poll before we pause. We're going to ask you all a question. If you could answer the question on the screen would be helpful. To what extent are you thinking about business building in the crisis to get to the next normal?
43% had already started, followed by 28% in thinking about it. So almost half of our group has already started.
Yeah, so what strikes me is less than 10% are not yet thinking about it. Everybody else is moving on it, which is exciting to see, and it's frankly consistent directionally with what we're seeing kind of across industries. The real question here is how do you do it successfully, which is the hard part. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I'll just jump in for the sort of 35% odd who are thinking about it, but also for the sort of broad majority that have already started. How are your clients thinking about how to prioritize business building in the crisis, given cash flow struggles, given sort of shareholder pressures to restructure, etc.? How are they thinking about prioritizing it?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? We're in a time where the need is high to innovate, but we're also resource constrained, at least in a lot of places. I think a lot of companies are coming to the realization that their new way of competing and being successful requires a different product set, a different delivery model, in some cases different distribution model, and a different operating model. And some companies, not all, are thinking if I took the time to transform the core to try to meet that need, it would take me too long and I would fall behind. And so it may be faster and more effective for me to just build something ground up off to the side quickly, new architecture, new people, test and learn, rapid, agile operating model to get to where I need to. And so the choice, which used to be a really important one, now is defaulting much more to build something new and build it quickly in a lot of companies, not all companies. And so capital is being diverted to that. The second thing is, I think you're seeing a lot of kind of parallel programs being run, which is finding capacity in the core, right? Freeing up capacity and redirecting it to the new build. So you don't have to spend more money and more capital, but are there things you're doing in your traditional business model that are either inefficient or are not needed anymore in this new world we're entering? And can you create capacity from that and redirect whether it's spend or time or people towards this new thing you're building? And then the final thing I'd say is a lot of companies are exploring ecosystems and partnerships a lot more, in part because of this resource challenge. So maybe there's a consortium that can come together to solve a problem that will help defray costs or balance investments across, not to mention bringing different capabilities to the party that can help win in a new market. So there's no silver bullet, but there's different techniques we're seeing companies use kind of to get there.
Super helpful. I think there's going to be a ton of questions on if I can prioritize this, how do I do this? So hopefully we'll come to those towards the end.
Yeah, I mean, the how, this is the, it's easy to say everybody's thinking about it, and it's true. Getting it done right and building things that will actually scale and over time create value, and a lot of companies that's profitability, is really hard to do. Our surveys show that if you just look across industries, it's something like 10% of new builds that corporates launch or startups end up reaching certain scale and being successful. So it's not exactly a safe path, And it's because it's very hard to do. But those that can figure it out, and we'll talk a lot about this, and Jason will get into some of this, those that figure it out, there's a huge reward there.
Awesome. Thank you, Ari.
Yep, thanks, Sean. Maybe a good time to pivot now to kind of what are the archetypes and what does it take to be successful here?
Great, thanks, Ari. So if we go to the next page here, this shows that many of the large companies that we know today have emerged from crises. And there's two things that we wanted to take away from this page. The first is that many of the ideas to come out of a crisis persist long after the crisis is gone. I know a lot of us are thinking, when this is over and when COVID is gone, are we all just going to go back to normal? And the jury is still out, and we don't have a crystal ball on that. But certainly, what we've seen in the past is crises show people what is possible, and sometimes you find out that something that is possible now is better or more effective or more customer-centric than before. And that really is the foundation of many of these businesses that emerge during crises. The second thing that we thought was interesting about this is there's a pattern to some of the companies that emerge in crises. Maybe if I point to the financial crisis, and this is notwithstanding, of course, some of the challenges that many of these companies are facing now with COVID, these companies challenged core assumptions during the financial crisis that were actually quite affected by the financial crisis. So companies like Uber and Airbnb question whether assets needed to have sole ownership, and the notion that someone could lease out their assets for use by others. The gig economy emerged from companies that questioned the notion that that people had to have one traditional job. And those assumptions that have been questioned created the space for many of these companies to emerge and have persisted long after the financial crisis has been resolved. So we asked ourselves, what are those assumptions that we should be challenging given the current crisis and given the current economy? Out of that came 6 archetypes, if we go to the next page. These archetypes represent spaces where we expect innovators to find new opportunities going forward. These can be opportunities to either help resolve the crisis or opportunities to propel a business going forward after the crisis. The 6 that we've highlighted, the first is the remote services provider. And this could be services, I mean, we've got a guy here repairing a piece of machinery from home. This could be the traditional service industry, but it also could be remote services like remote legal services, remote advisory services, any type of service provider today, thinking about how to do that remotely, thinking about how to do that enabled by artificial intelligence. So one interesting example here is I've seen clients recently or organizations recently develop artificial intelligence for the repair of equipment, such that when instead of someone having to look in a big binder and find what they think is the problem, they get a single set of instructions, do X, now do Y, that automatically adapts to what you're finding in the prior steps. The second archetype here is around the collaboration platform. I know we've all discovered some of that because we're all here on Zoom in a novel collaboration platform. There is so much more opportunity in collaboration platforms than has been tapped so far. And we're starting to see examples of specialty collaboration platforms for industries such as the legal industry or the healthcare industry. And that notion of how do you actually tailor collaboration to the types of interactions that that your employees or your customers are going to require is super valuable. A lot of companies actually, a lot of my clients are thinking about collaboration platforms between the company and customers during this time. The third is the dynamic talent deployer. This one is really interesting. I think a lot of us understood that reskilling at scale and agile talent deployment was going to be really important, but we all, prior to this crisis, thought of it as an enormous lift. What we've seen really interesting examples of, for example, entire workforces be shifted from, say, the airline industry to food service and grocery delivery in a very short period of time. And again, companies are using technology and digital and analytics to reskill people at scale. If I continue,
jump in on the dynamic talent deployer. Are you seeing? I know sort of there's increasing globalization of healthcare, especially things like radiography. Are you seeing any changes or clients thinking about changes to their operating model in the sort of healthcare environment to take advantage of the sort of new global network of talent?
Yeah, absolutely. And even beyond globally, or even kind of before you get to globally, there is a big step in healthcare around regional talent deployment that has actually been a challenge hitherto now. What's really interesting, and one macro thought, is regulators in many of these spaces have become more creative in this period, and so companies have found opportunities to collaborate to try and think of new and innovative approaches that may have sort of sat at the back of the queue before this crisis. And telemedicine, whether it's teleradiology or other forms of telemedicine, has obviously exploded. And we've seen regulators around the world open both the regulatory pathways and the reimbursement pathways to make telemedicine happen and create a more dynamic market for healthcare providers. I mean, this includes, for example, getting referrals for, so pharmaceutical companies are thinking about this as well in terms of how do you help patients get referrals for essential drugs that they need when they may not be able to visit their primary care physician. So if I go clockwise, the high-touch digital retailer, this is one that's really captured by that. And I saw some comments in the chat box about the real estate example. And then I think someone may have brought up about due diligences from in the private equity and venture capital space. This is really important because there's a lot of activities and a lot of sales that I think we all just assumed had to be in person. And we are starting to realize that it either has to be digital or it's not going to happen in the near term. And so companies are being much more creative about how do you actually make an experience feel personalized, whether it's through video, whether it's through augmented reality, whether it's through just true personalization and making sure the content is truly tailored to the user, that makes a retail experience that is digital also feel high touch. The fourth one is the data visionary. This is all about how do you use data that previously may not have been, that may have been either overlooked or may have been deprioritized because you had human heuristic methods of gaining insights. And a lot of data, in fact, in my world, in healthcare, we're really seeing this become important because folks are saying, how do I actually pick up on data, whether it's passive data from wearables or from your phone, or whether in the capital equipment space, just data on how technology is operating. We're also seeing this in manufacturing, where you're saying, how do I pull data off of my assembly line that I might not have looked at before because I had people that were thinking about it. And now how do I actually tap into raw data to do really exciting and interesting things? And then finally, the resilient and flexible operator. This is one that if we talk about innovation being born of necessity, this one really is a place where companies are feeling the necessity, which is all of a sudden companies are being told you need to have a much more flexible and resilient supply chain because your suppliers may not be available, and you may have to move inventory rapidly between markets if, as you find that some geographies are opening up whereas others are staying closed. And how do you do that without tying up more capital? We're seeing all sorts of creative digital and analytic solutions around that. And one that we highlighted in our article, which I think is a particularly interesting one, is using artificial intelligence to say, for a given part, what are the characteristics of that part? What are the characteristics of suppliers that I use? And how can I use artificial intelligence to find either connections between those suppliers and others, such as through shared customers or common characteristics that wouldn't necessarily be advertised, such that I can find a wider pool of potential suppliers. And we were able to create a significant multiple on the number of potential suppliers for this tricky part by using this technique. We're also seeing a lot of work being done about how to use digital analytics to move inventory between geographies and be prepared to do that in a very fast clip. Of course, we're seeing that in healthcare, where we need to move supplies towards affected regions. We're also seeing that in other spaces around when markets are going to open up. So if we go to the next page, now I've done a lot of talking. I would love to hear from you. So if you could either take the annotate button, which should be at the top of your screen, and put a little star or a stamp of your choice on the screen for the archetypes that you think are going to be most important in your industry. And then would love if you could, in the chat window, just share any ideas or thoughts or questions that you have. I'm actually struck by how, there's probably more on the top than the bottom, but I'm actually struck by how each of these archetypes has relevance to folks. I don't see one that pops. I think certainly the first two look like ones that have a particular, or the first three. And so I think here we just, on the remote services provider, I think the opportunities are more straightforward. The question really becomes, how do you excel and how do you use digital and technology? On the collaboration platform, I find that one particularly fun and interesting because you need to ask yourselves, what type of collaboration do you need? And how do you actually purpose build a platform for that? We've seen a lot of that actually in my world in healthcare, where folks are creating collaboration platforms for sharing data, whether it's actually mostly clinical data. There's so many companies that have clinical data and so many companies that need it, and creating platforms for using that data effectively has been, I've seen a real surge in that in my space. Ari, would you like to comment on what you're seeing across the top of this page?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in, Jason and Ari, just to add. It'd be great to hear sort of where you're seeing the most energy in your client conversations around each of these archetypes.
Yeah, my personal observations, the remote services provider has been the most immediate kind of spike, because a lot of businesses just need to continue to serve their customers, almost independent of what business they're in. And so their immediate question is, how do I do that remotely? And many of them have that already, and it's about scaling. Some of them don't, and it's about quickly launching a new digital business or a new digital way of serving. But any business that's either B2C, where you create a direct channel, or B2B2C, where you're enabling your commercial, your business partner to serve their own end customers digitally. So remote sales tools and capabilities, remote service tools, capabilities, analytics around client retention, next product to buy, all these things are kind of the immediate, at least what I'm seeing. Now, once we get past that, and we are getting past that, all of these other ones are popping up, right? Resilience is a big one, flexibility, as companies start to reimagine the new normal and think about how to set up their organization for not just the next 3 weeks, but the next 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. You see a lot more on the resilient and flexible operator, the dynamic talent deployer, collaboration. All of these things are coming up. But the remote services and then the digital retailer, of course, which I think is a little bit related to that, are immediately spiking.
Yeah. Ari, if I might add one thing to that. So I think the collaboration platform it has also been really critical. I've seen a lot of interest from my clients in saying, how do you create a platform for the collaboration between the company and customers? So it's sort of a turbocharged inside sales plus self-service plus e-commerce. How do you create a seamless experience across those things in a very short order? And I, to the point where several clients in my world have said, we're just going to shift massive proportions, like half of our budget in marketing to digital channels, so that you could create a novel collaboration platform.
One of the questions, Jason, it's worth mentioning one of the observations in the chat, which is that in times of change, the change executives come at a premium, which will actually support the dynamic talent deployer archetype. I think one of the questions that often comes up is how to think about finding the right talent for these new builds, and also how do I think about compensating this talent when it sort of risks demotivating the existing organization. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to certainly how to think about finding this talent for the new builds.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I would say, if we think about what are the, in addition, so if I take a little bit of a step back, I would say business builders have always been a little bit different from traditional businesses. And one of the ways in which they've been different is they are really aggressive about challenging assumptions and not taking any assumptions for granted. There are other ways in which they are different from traditional businesses as well. And those ways also are really important lessons for folks who are trying to build businesses during COVID. One of them is talent. So business builders recognize that it's a different kind of talent that you need to build a business than in the traditional organization. So some examples of that. product ownership. Typically, that is a function that is kind of managing an ongoing a product. Creating a new product from scratch is a totally different endeavor and requires a different type of mini CEO mindset than simply a category manager that you might have prior. Design is a really important function where you think about the user and the complete user experience end to end, and how you actually design a future state journey that is inspiring to the customer or the user. There is technology skills around creating architecture and actually roles around agile, such as a scrum master or an agile coach, that many companies who are used to creating legacy products using a traditional step-by-step approach and on a legacy architecture platform may not have. And so companies, we are finding companies do need to bring in new talent to accomplish that. Companies also need to make sure that they sponsor and mentor the talent that they have.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is just on this compensation point, one of the interesting things that I saw a couple of companies do to deal with this different profile and different risk reward profile of a new business is creating shadow equity. So almost mimicking a startup compensation structure by using kind of virtual or shadow equity, so that there's a bigger upside for those entrepreneurs and those skill sets that otherwise would have options in the startup world. But also their compensation is maybe more closely linked to what they're building and the value they're creating.
Should we go to the next page? Because actually this hits on some of the points that folks are raising. So we've put on this page a little bit about the how. So once you've questioned assumptions, once you've then found a space that you want to innovate in, what do you go do? There's a series of timeless activities, many of which we've highlighted in a different article we wrote a couple months ago, and we'll share to everybody. These include, one, getting sponsorship from the top, and this includes sponsorship of the talent. It also includes making sure that you're actually investing financially in this endeavor, and in many ways investing more like a VC fund would, based on milestones, versus investing in a kind of annual budget cycle that the rest of the company might be using. There's this notion of pressure testing assumptions, and that is something that you do at the beginning, but it's also something you do throughout. And the notion of making sure that you are constantly going back to your users and customers and asking them, what do you think, is at the heart of creating a great product using agile methodologies. The third one, going clockwise, is around building dedicated teams. We talked about that a little bit, but it's really important that the team focus on this new innovation, and this team be somewhat unencumbered by the rest of the business. And as Ari mentioned at the beginning, part of the value of creating new businesses is you don't get burdened by the weight of the rest of the company. And that is part of what allows you to move fast, especially in times like this. And dedicated teams are critical to that. And then the last one here that's really important is tapping into your unique strengths as an organization. It's really important to build a business where you can be successful. And that is, you're having, whether it be customers, whether it be experience, whether it be a talent set, is what gives many traditional companies advantages over startups. There are some new activities because we're working in this remote environment, making sure that you continue to constantly challenge yourself and continue to debate and hear from customers and pivot as appropriate is really important. It's also important to make sure that you continue to maintain your processes and your stand-ups, and in fact, perhaps even more important, because the casual conversations you're just not going to have as frequently. Making sure that you have a strong culture, and we've seen companies come up with all sorts of creative and interesting ideas, whether it's like everybody ordering one type of cuisine from their houses wherever they are and having a team dinner, or whether it's I have indeed even seen team karaoke, which I personally was on mute for most of. And then, of course, making sure that you maintain your external orientation. Business building is all about staying connected to the user and staying connected to the customer and staying connected to the market. And it's so easy when you're remote to just focus on the team that's doing the building and forget that you need to be in front of customers all the time. And you've got to find more creative ways to get in front of customers. So using things like screen shares. And I've had some teams that were creating software businesses where we just found a user and we turned on screen share and they just did their work for the day. And our team was there and they'd check in and they'd monitor here and there. And in many ways, it actually was kind of a new and interesting way to observe just in the background without being intrusive. We have to find ways to stay connected to customers and keep talking to customers even though you're remote.
Okay, so Jason and Ari, one of the questions that I received in the private message feed, and for those sort of on the line, feel free to shoot any messages directly as well, is how can you, this is to the left-hand side, how can you use the unfair advantage without getting snarled up in legacy processes and mindsets, etc.? For example, if I need to use the corporate, legal, or marketing, those are all parts of the steady old business with all the red tape that involves.
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, the art here is how to use what you need, but not anymore from the mothership. And so first step is to figure out what is the unfair advantage, whether it's data or it's a brand or it's distribution or customer or a couple of very smart people. Figure out what that is. The second step is, how do you redefine the kind of service level agreements and the expectations from a timing perspective on all of the different functions that are needed to run a business? So a lot of people always talk about legal and compliance and audit. Well, you may end up having people from legal or compliance and audit in the corporate mothership being used in the new build, but the expectations for turnaround time and how they work need to be set up differently, right? So what may be fine in the mothership, 3 months to turn around a report on audit to say you're red, yellow, green, is not going to fly in a new business build environment. So maybe you have someone from that team bring practices into your new build, but they have very different SLAs. Maybe they have 3 days, not 3 months. Maybe they don't create a large report on the full thing, but they evaluate a different module every time and they create a bite-sized insight. So there are ways we've seen successful builds leverage the best of their in-house functions, but set them up in a different way with different expectations so that you don't slow down the new build. And if you ever get to a place where you are slowing it down dramatically and it feels like you're moving at the pace of the corporate environment, then you've already lost the game, generally speaking. So that's what I would say. I mean, the unfair advantage is meant to be a very narrow surgical asset you bring over versus bringing over half of your processes and people from the corporate environment. If it's not narrow and not targeted, then you're probably bringing too much.
Very helpful. Another of the ones that I think comes up a lot, Ari, and this is somewhat linked, is sort of knowing all the pitfalls of business building, how to think about governance, both of the new business, but also the governance between the existing and the new.
Yeah, we are big fans of creating real separation from a governance perspective between the old and the new. That doesn't mean that you run it completely separately like a startup. Obviously, there's still a management team and a CEO and a board for the whole thing. But to the extent you can upfront decide the rules of the road around, we're going to allocate this much capital and we're to the new build, and we're going to give the new build team this much freedom. Once you set those rules up, making it difficult for executives in the core company to intervene, to say, hey, why are we doing this? Should we really spend that money? The less you can create this kind of portfolio prioritization, decision making across the whole thing, the better off you'll be. We find where these things tend to fall down is where you have frequent reprioritization of spending and of people and of time across the old and the new. And when you're doing that all the time and you have different expectations on both sides, on one side, a mature business that is probably creating profit on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. On the other side, a new build that needs an incubation period, 6 months, a year, or 2 years to really get going. If you minimize the frequent reprioritization, the better off you'll be. So you set it up, you create some distance, and you give this new build some room to operate somewhat independently from the core.
I think one of the things that that Peter has mentioned on the chat feed, which I think is interesting as well, and to your point, sorry, is as the change exec or the sort of new business lead, negotiate your terms up front with sponsors, including preferential access to mothership resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think
totally
it's a great
agree.
point. It's just one last thing, and then Chase, also negotiating how you want to measure success for the new build is really important, right? So let's say they give you all the freedom in the world, but then they show up a year later asking the wrong questions. That's not helpful either. So what does success look like 3 months in, 6 months in, a year in, et cetera, will be important to clarify up front. All right, Jason.
No, I totally agree with that. And Peter, I completely agree with what you've said as well. And I think it's important to frame up the expectations of, are you being, that, for example, brand standards may not necessarily apply, or the rules around who you can email and how you can email from outgoing marketing may not apply. And you're going to have a turnaround time of X days, or you're going to have one legal person, for example, who's on call at all times to service this new business. Those kind of, getting clarity on those kind of things is really important, and that's why getting sponsorship from the top is really important. Inevitably, there will always be issues that come up and folks that didn't get the memo about what about how the new business is supposed to operate. And so having someone at the top that can set those norms is really important. I also think Ari's point about incentives and aligning incentives and setting incentives is really important. I want to make sure that that's fully fleshed out. So one, I think what Ari was saying really resonates with my experience and what we've learned, which is it's a different set of financial expectations that you would hold the traditional business to versus new. And so it's important to make them really clear. Otherwise, businesses tend to sort of slide into old ways of management. It's also really important to make sure that you have everyone on the business building team incentivized using the same set of metrics. Because what you don't want to have is some people who are solving for more traditional style business metrics, and some folks who are solving for kind of new business growth using under the understanding that there's going to be an incubation period, because that will inevitably lead to conflict.
One of the questions that has come up is on sort of in the new world or the new digital retail world, is there an expectation for marketplaces to outperform other retailers? It might be worth broadening this a little bit to sort of other industries, which is, you know, how are we seeing the emergence of ecosystems as a competitive advantage for sort of new businesses that are launching?
Art, do you want to start here?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think Sean, you should let us know who you'd like to answer. I think I mentioned this earlier. Ecosystems are on the rise, and ecosystems are on the rise because first off, we're trying to meet evolving customer needs that inevitably require more and more different capabilities from different angles, and that requires partnerships. The second is this cost point, right? More companies are going in together because not any one company necessarily has the capital they need to scale a new business. So I think we're seeing more and more of these ecosystem plays. You're seeing a lot of startup and tech companies kind of get, with who are struggling to find cash right now, get gobbled up either through partnership or through acquisition. But we'll see where the world goes, right? We'll see if a year or two from now we feel the same way. But we're seeing a bit of a rise in customers kind of pulling these groups of companies together to meet a need.